the demonic struggle that we have in our life here on this earth. And we were talking, or I was talking, about the reality of the subtleness of the enemy. And so I'm just going to spend just a little bit of time on how do we discern in this struggle we find ourselves in. Classically speaking, the three enemies that we face, when I say classically speaking, are kind of the terminology that's used. It's the flesh, the world, and the devil. So the flesh, it's not that our bodies are bad, it's just that, we have, and we'll talk about this tonight, we have a wounded human nature. So, and as I mentioned before, we're the gatekeeper. So we're the ones, the enemy can't do anything, or be more specific, the devil can't do anything against us unless we are willing to let him in. Let him influence us. We'll come back to that. So the flesh, the world, okay, once again, the world isn't evil because the world has been created by God, but the world is, we being in a fallen state, okay, the world has been influenced. And maybe I should be, like I said, these are classic terms that are used. So I wanted to use the terms, but maybe I would call it, maybe instead of saying the world, and you can certainly say that, the culture, this would be the world, as St. Paul would say, the world without the Spirit of Christ. Okay, so this is another phrase that we might use. This is the godless culture that we live in, which is, well, yeah, that's a whole other story. But basically, there are many things within our culture that are, at least, they're distractions, and at worst, they're really pulling us away from Christ, from the truth. So, flesh, the world, and then the devil. And the devil is the one that we typically think of. The flesh, we're not battling against ourselves. I mean, we may or may not be helping the cause, if you will, but it's not like we have a dual personality and, the fallen human nature of us is plotting against us. It's just weight that's pulling us down, so to speak. But like I said, we'll talk about that more in a little bit. It's not, and the world isn't plotting against us. I mean, even though, there are elements within the world, all that kind of stuff. But those are more the what would you say, the actors within Satan's camp, So there are deceivers, and there are those who, there's different levels of deception, on the part of the enemy and things like that. But there are people that are working against the truth, but they're not necessarily, they're can I think of the right word? They're actors in a bigger drama. They're not the ones. For example, you might say, well, I know exactly, it's like Planned Parenthood. They are clearly this and that. Well, are they? Absolutely. And they're part of the false prophets of the day. However, they're not really ultimately calling the shots. They're not the puppet masters, so to speak, of the powers of darkness. They are the victims as well. And I'm not going to get into that. Are they willing victims? We're not going to get into that kind of stuff. So, but the enemy, or more specifically, the devil, is the only one who actually has a concrete, realistic, very subtle plan he is using against us. So he's the only one who's plotting against us. So we have to watch all three. We have to be, aware of all three, and we have to understand that each one has a certain power, that we have to be aware of. So I said that the enemy is very, very subtle. Let me just read a quote from. Let's see if I can see it. Because we typically think of the enemy's workings, his strategies, and his tactics against us as being, the real flashy stuff. And that's simply not the case. It is true that, this kind of stuff, possessions and obsessions and oppressions and things of that nature. It is true that extraordinary activity of the enemy is increasing in many ways because our culture is becoming, well, we're drifting, and we're also actively moving away from Christ. And you can't move away from Christ and just be, neutral. Okay, there always will come with it that hatred of God. Okay, so you can't move. It's like Judas, but it's kind of another story. But I don't want to get too far down that path. So we don't want to just focus on the extraordinary activity because yes, it's true. Yes, it happens. Probably more than likely will never happen to any of us here in this room. We might experience it, but it's not common, especially where we live. If we're living out in certain areas of the country and of the world, absolutely, you're going to see that out a lot more. If we live down, in Haiti, okay, we're going to see a lot of Santeria and stuff like that. If you live in some African cultures, you can see a lot of voodoo and stuff like that. If you live in, I don't know if it's just in Mexico, or I'm sure it's not just in Mexico, but a lot of the stuff that is involved with literally translated, it's holy death, but it has nothing to do with what we think of as holy death. And I can't speak a word of Spanish, so I'm utterly useless with it. But it's like Santa Muerto or something like that.
Santa
really,
Muerta?
yeah, really evil stuff, very, very demonic, and yeah, it has nothing to do with what we say holy death or absolutely nothing. So absolutely, that stuff is real, and it's growing, unfortunately, because we don't have the ability, but it's growing because the ordinary activity of Satan is growing. You cannot have a growth in the extraordinary activity of the enemy without having first the growth or the moving forward of his ordinary activity. Okay, and because it would be absolutely counterproductive, for the enemy to do that. But so his ordinary activity, as I said before, isn't really glamorous. They don't make movies about it. Well, they do make movies about it, but you don't really know you're watching. Like, oh, this is about Satan, because it's not the Hollywood, the head spinning around, the pea soup coming out, and stuff like that. It's just, very subtle. Like, here I'll give you an example. And that this is an older example. I mean, it's not old, but it's older. And I know when the movie came out, I've seen clips of it, I think on TV. I've never seen the entire movie. And it's a shame because it probably could have been a good movie. But this is a classic, what I would call ordinary form temptation. And I hope I don't totally, like, if you're like, I can't believe you said that movie's no good. Titanic. I'm like, what was that movie's called again? Yeah, bad movie, really bad movie. Because it was what?
It was built
Oh
in
yeah,
Ireland.
yeah.
There we go.
The ship, nothing wrong with the ship other than it really didn't work very well. But that's a whole other factor. But the movie itself, because it is so, there were parts of it that where you're like, oh, this is really good and it's romantic and this and that and everything. But then you start stripping later and think, okay, is it really romantic? Well, no, and it could have been good, but not when you start really thinking about it and stripping the layers down and say, oh, it glorifies that which is not of God. And anything that glorifies, you don't have to have a movie about, some, satanic, whatever drug cartel that's killing everybody. I mean, that's kind of even that's not always obvious to everybody because people might, but it's the subtle, the things that are subtle, that's where the enemy moves forward and gains ground most effectively because it's always cloaked under the guise of truth, beauty, and goodness, and all of that. You think, oh yeah, but he loved her and this and that. And I'm not saying that, I don't know, I'm not trying to analyze the film because it's just one of many, but it was an extremely popular film. And it was a film that everyone was like, oh, it's so romantic. Unless you really start to understand it from a perspective of truth, then you think, okay, it's not so romantic after all, but it's actually kind of deceptive because it's all about self-will, And anyway, not here to tear it apart, but just saying that's one of the ways that the enemy gets into things, and it's very, subtle. So this is a quote. I think he's, I can't remember if he's a French or Italian, Dominican. It doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. He lived in the time period of, or at least part of his life, and was during the time period of World War I, which I suspect is kind of where he uses the image of the poisonous gas, where he gets the image of the poisonous gas. But he says, he, meaning Satan, he need only enter into the stream of our own inclinations when we treat lightly things that lead us astray. He has only to press against that which already totters, to hold back that which seeks to rise. His influence spreads like poisonous gas, which we inhale without knowing it. That's how the enemy works. That's his primary way. That's the ordinary way in which the enemy works. And he doesn't always have to do a whole lot. Okay, we can't do anything on our own good, not a single thing. I mean, absolutely zero. Because when our Lord says, "Without me, you can do nothing," he's not just using a hyperbole. He means it. Nothing. So, any good, we can. We can't even take the credit to cooperate with that good, because that in and of itself is also a grace. So everything is grace. Okay, and so it's a good way to discern. Okay, what's God's will, what's the enemy's will, because if someone is actually seeking to love God and love his neighbor, there is something of God working in that person's life. It may be big, it may be small, because we can't do nothing good that we do can we say, that's me. Okay. Now, on the other hand, when we do evil, it's not as if Satan has got us in a stranglehold. He may not have even had to do anything, but let's say he did, and he just tempted us. Okay. All that is, sin is I'm doing my will over God's will. So sin isn't really, we don't necessarily, as someone I'm going to quote, or I'm going to tell you about later in a little bit, he said, we need to give the devil his due, but we don't want to, give him too much credit. There's a lot of evil stuff that we do, sinful stuff that we do. He might not have had anything to do with it. He'll magnify it. He'll work with that. But left to our own, we end up in the ditch, spiritually speaking. We are not like decent, people that, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more when we talk about concupiscence and what the effects of original sin are. But we have to recognize we already have a proclivity, an inclination, to do things our own way as opposed to God's way. So we have to fight against that. And unfortunately, the enemy then tries to magnify that. And so we have to recognize we need to discern wisely. Okay. So let me just throw out something, and I don't want to get into, because we could spend weeks on this and just be, not really even fully completing the study. But let me just kind of throw out just two aspects, because it's extremely important. Well, maybe three aspects. A precondition and then two kind of rules of thumb. It's extremely important that we when we're thinking about we're in battle, you want to know what the right thing to do is. You want to know, if you're training soldiers, you have to train them so that they know how to act in battle, how to follow commands, how to discern. et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to get too far into that analogy. But so we need to know, well, what is God's will? And what would the enemy's will be? Okay. And as I said before, anything that is seeking it to love God and to love our neighbor is always going to be coming from God. Now, that doesn't mean that it's, because we can be deceived in that, but, that's coming from God. So because it's a goodness, it's a grace, okay? But we have, unfortunately, in ourselves, anything that's about self, and I'm not talking about, something that's logical, okay? You need to take care of your health, so you can, raise your children, for example. Okay, now that's not being selfish. That's being, realistic about your vocation life, et cetera, et cetera. But anything that's self-indulgent, and I'm not talking about, oh, you ate a chocolate bar or something like that. I'm talking about, anything that's self-willed, that's all about me, that's always a good sign. That's not from God, okay? So how do we know, how do we discern? Okay, that's sort of and I'm going to basically just be taking a little bit from St. Ignatius of Loyola. So in order to discern properly, okay, we need to first, the precondition is I honestly, sincerely, totally, completely desire to do God's will. Now, I don't think there's a single one of us that can, if I would ask the question, do you desire to do God's will perfectly? Well, no. Now, hopefully we are striving to have that desire and that intentionality to live God's will. But if I say, because sometimes in the confessional, I'll ask people, they're struggling with something. I said, well, do you really want, I said, I'm not trying to be snarky or anything, but do you really want to overcome this? Because I said, I might say, gosh, I ate too much. Okay, need to stop that. Okay, do I really want to overcome that? Well, not really, but sort of. But it's a mixed bag. And for most people, it is a mixed bag. But if I sincerely am seeking and desiring to do God's will, okay, then that's a massive foundation that we're standing on. Okay. But we have to recognize it's a mixed bag for all of us. And so we have to continually keep seeking to do God's will. So there's sort of two different ways to say the same thing. And so working off of that. So if that precondition is met, or if we are seeking to meet that precondition and say, yes, I absolutely want to do God's will. Whatever that may be, I want to do it. And please God, help me to want to do it even more, et cetera, et cetera. Then as a good rule of thumb, okay, if we're trying to discern what is God's will in this situation, if there is a sense of peace, then that is God's will. Okay? I'm being very, very simplistic, and I'm going to actually then put it into St. Ignatius's words and kind of detail this out a little bit.
Is this the second precondition, or just kind of?
No, if you are seeking to do God's will, and not just sort of in a general, vague sort of yeah, whatever, but no, I want my life to be pleasing to God. I want, above all else, I want to do His will. But I know that I'm not really completely pure in that perspective, and therefore I need God's grace to want that, to do His will even more. If we have a humility, that we recognize I'm not, because humility is always going to defeat the enemy. Pride is always going to aid him. Okay, so if we're yeah, I know, I'm doing God's will. I'm a nice person. Yeah, we're already in the backyard, and we already lost our way, so to speak. So, but if we are seeking that to do God's will, then if we think, now I know, I think this is it. How do I know this is God's will versus, how do I know this is coming from God? This what we think maybe is an inspiration, for example. How do I know that that's coming from God, or how do I know that that isn't coming from the enemy? Well, if it gives us a sense of peace, okay, then that is a good sign that that is of God's will. Versus, let me just read. I'll tell you who this is in just a few moments. But so, see if I can actually find it. Okay, so if there is anxiety, just use kind of do peace versus anxiety. Okay, if there's a sense of peace, good sign, very, very good sign. This is God's will. If there's anxiety, and I'll detail this out in just a moment, good sign, this is coming from the evil spirit. All is linked to that precondition that I want to do. I sincerely, honestly, with everything in me, want to do God's will. Okay. Not going to be perfect at that, but I have the humility to recognize, all right, I need God's grace to desire this even more. So, let's see. So, the evil spirit causes confusion, doubt, insecurity, despondency, anxiety, worry, and if we allow him, despair. Okay. Now, that's the simple way to kind of put it. That's in someone else's words. I'm going to give you St. Ignatius because this is what, and I'll explain who, and I'm going to give you a little example of this. So, because it's extremely important to be able to discern, because a lot of things will present themselves at first glance as like, well, yeah, seems good to me, you know, but they're not. That's why, for example, you know, evil always likes to come under. Evil does not present itself as, oh yeah, this is evil. The devil is not stupid, so he knows he's got to bait the hook. So evil always comes under the guise of good. Okay, it's not good, but it's always under the guise of good. That's why I said a movie like Titanic, although having some good things, some good aspects, you could say, is deceptive because of the ultimate message. So this is St. Ignatius, who was a master. It's interesting, St. Ignatius, and I'm not going to get into this. This is one of my favorite saints. St. Ignatius, I don't think you could say he was a former soldier. He always was. He trained to be a soldier, and he became a soldier, and a very effective one in many ways. In fact, in the decisive battle that he was wounded. Once the garrison wanted to give up, and he wouldn't let them give up. Okay, and he wasn't like the commanding officer by any means. He was just this incredibly zealous, courageous soldier. And when the French, one of their shots of their cannon, they raked through and they broke. I can't remember which. Broke one of his legs and then ripped off part of the calf muscle on the other leg, and he went down, and the whole garrison surrendered then. So that kind of shows you the personality of St. Ignatius. He never ceased being a soldier. He just changed commanding officers. Instead of following an earthly commanding officer, he followed now Jesus Christ. And so he has a very much of a soldier mentality, and he has a very kind of anyway. So he has rules of discernment. He has quite a few rules of discernment, but these are the first two. They're the most, I don't say the most important, but they're the foundational, if you will. So I'm just going to read it, and I'm going to kind of explain it just a little bit. Like I said, I think we need, this is just, it's good. It's a primary source. We need to kind of have that, okay, got it. We're going to, because it's so critical to understand. So he says the first rule, in persons who are going from mortal sin to mortal sin. So these are people that they really don't care about doing God's will. And not just like, I'm trying, and I slip into mortal sin necessarily. But they're just living for themselves. They don't really care. And they might be really nice people. They might be great neighbors. But so you can't necessarily judge the book by its cover, so to speak. But they're going from mortal sin to mortal sin. The enemy is ordinarily accustomed to propose apparent pleasures to them, leading them to imagine sensual delights and pleasures in order to hold them more and make them grow in their vices and sins. So they're already working in the direction the enemy wants them to be working in. And so he just basically kind of tries to soothe them and like, oh, this is wonderful. and by proposing apparent pleasures and sensual kind of delights and things of that nature, just let's keep everything moving in this direction because this is working out well for me. I'm, of course, personifying the enemy at this point. So the evil spirit works in that way. St. Ignatius says, and this is the same, this is rule number 1. In these persons, the persons that are going from mortal sin to mortal sin, they do not have that precondition that they want sincerely and honestly and genuinely, they want to do God's will. They don't have that. That's completely not there. In these persons, the good spirit, now the good spirit, God, the angels, ultimately it's always God. Okay, but God might be directly or it might be indirectly through the angels, or through the saints, or through maybe a good person that he's able to influence and bring into this person's life. So in these persons, the good spirit uses a contrary method, stinging and biting their consciences through their rational power of moral judgment. This is why it's very important to understand you can't just say, well, if it feels, like everything's going well, it must be God. Well, it all depends on that condition. Are you going from mortal sin to mortal sin? Or, as he will say in the second one, persons who are going on intensely purifying their sins, rising from good to better in the service of God our Lord. Okay, so what's the state of existence of the person? If the person is going from mortal sin to mortal sin, they're already doing the enemy's bidding in a sense, and the enemy just needs to okay, let's just make this all seem really good, But the good spirit, so God needs to smack him upside the head, so to speak, and uses things that we would say, oh, well, I don't think God uses that. Yes, he does in those. But notice the evil spirit, okay, in the things, if that person is going from mortal sin to mortal sin, they use this is why we cannot rely upon feelings. This is why we can't rely upon emotions. Because the enemy, emotions, feelings, they are part of our will. Okay, so ultimately, yeah, we are in control of that. However, there's sort of a fleshy part of our will. They can be affected by, well, to use, famous, Charles Dickens analogy of Scrooge. He's like, you could be, a bit of undigested potato, or a lot of mustard, or if I swallowed this toothpick, I'd have demons chasing me all over the place, Yeah, but it's true, our emotions and feelings and all that, that's kind of a fleshy part of our will. It can be manipulated by just things that are completely outside of our control in the environment, or they can be manipulated by the evil spirit. And that's exactly what the evil spirit does, because he leads them to imagine sensual delights and pleasures. It's all kind of part of that, like, oh, this is great, Whereas where God, the good spirit, okay, uses their rational power of moral judgment. This is not pleasing. You're like, it's that great when people are like, oh, that's that Catholic guilt. Catholic guilt usually doesn't come through good, authentic guilt, like transformative guilt. It doesn't come through our emotions. It comes through okay, I know my mother, God rest her soul, would be just freaking out if she knew I was living this kind of life. Because I know she would, or whatever the thought process may be. There's a rational, and we just whatever, just don't, I'm not, just, you try to, and the enemy tries to push that up by just, oh, isn't it just all wonderful? It's all nice and great, and, whatever. I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit, but the flip side of this coin, okay, this is the second rule of discernment, the basic fundamental rule of discernment. In persons who are going on intensely purifying their sins and rising from good to better in the service of God our Lord. So people who are seeking to do God's will, it's seriously, honestly, genuinely seeking to do God's will. And they're not just like, well, it'd be nice if I didn't cheat on my wife anymore, but well, maybe someday, well, no, it's like, okay, whatever, it's a stupid analogy. Well, it's not a stupid analogy, but you get my point. So, but they're making decisions and they're carrying them and they're making some progress. All right, totally different. Flips it up completely upside down. So in those persons, let's see, the method is contrary to that in the first rule. For them, it is proper to the evil spirit to bite, sadden, and place obstacles, disquieting with false reasons. Notice how the enemy isn't using, he's using like, oh, well, this is, he's trying to employ false reasons so that the person may not go forward. Ultimately to discourage them and maybe even to, kind of pull them back. Now, this is where, and I would not say these are emotions. These are much deeper than emotions, this next part. Okay? As Ignatius says, and it is proper, okay, in that person who's really seeking to do God's will and striving, making progress, okay, not perfect. It's not somebody who's perfect, because there's nobody who's perfect. And it's not someone, oh, you got to be like a canonizable saint at this point. It's just someone who's really like, I got to be serious about this. I got to please God, So it is proper to the good spirit to give courage and strength, consolations. Consolation is not the same thing as, oh, I feel really good. Consolation has a strength. It's not something that is just emotional. It's not just a feeling, Well, I don't really, people are like, I don't like this, whatever it is, because it doesn't make me feel good. That got nothing to do with it. So, or very little sometimes. So consolations, tears, inspirations, and quiet, easing and taking away all obstacles so that the person may go forward in doing good. Okay. So, in other words, if we're seeking to do God's will, okay, really seeking to do God's will, that's what we want ultimately. God's going to help us do it. He's going to give us courage and strength and consolation, not always, not every step of the way, but oftentimes in those not just often, not like God's like, well, it looked like they're struggling. Yeah, I'm not going to give them any grace. Especially at those points, those crisis moments, of those pivot, decisions, He's going to give us that strength and consolation and courage, and all those inspirations and that peace. Now we might say, "You want me to do what?" Holy cow! Well, that's gonna hurt. But we'll know. Be like, all right, we're moving forward. Let's go. Versus, when the enemy tries to shut us down, we're like, oh my gosh. And I think a good sign is when, and I'll read something in which will really kind of sink this home, whatever, put this in another perspective. The enemy always tries to shut us down. If we're trying to do God's will, the enemy always tries to say, oh, that's going to be really hard, and this and that. And we're like, oh, that ain't right, man, that is. Or, oh, maybe I'm not doing the right thing, or that anxiety, that discouragement. It has the net effect of it just shuts us down. It paralyzes us. Okay, so he's called the Prince of Darkness, because when we're in darkness, we're like, okay, I don't know where to go. I don't know what step to take next, and we tend to be like, okay, well, I'm just going to sit here and I know what to do, Whereas, our Lord is called the Prince of Peace. So these are not original ideas. So if you are in the slightest way impressed, be like, wow, Father really knows something. This is not. I'm just. Well, let me think of a different word. I'm just giving back what that I've pulled from sources, and I'm going to share a really, really, really good source in just a moment. So that's a key thing. But if we're just like, whatever, and we're living the life, the life. We're just living our life, whatever I want to do, which does not mean that we would necessarily be, the next one to be arrested, okay, or the next one that people think, I don't want to live next to him, or I don't want to work next to him, or anything like that. We could be very respectable. We could be like the best neighbors. We can have the great work ethic. We can be like, I don't know, whatever. We can be. You get the point. going from mortal sin to mortal sin doesn't make us some like creepy guy that, you know, you're like, yeah, he's over there, arrest him, you know. It's not the drug dealers. I mean, they too, but you know, you can be. This is the thing that people just kind of say, well, you know, those are the creepy people that are maybe going to end up in hell. You know, no, it's just if I say I want to do my will, thanks God, but no thanks. I'm going to do it my way. And we can be like with smile even. You're like, yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's not going to be great. It's not great now. It's not going to be great then. So you see the difference. There's a huge difference. Okay, you might think, wait, where am I in this spectrum? So let me put out a name that you want to be, I think, be familiar with. Now, I have a proclivity, I have a natural love of the Jesuits. Okay, now I'm gonna qualify that in a moment. If anybody's like, I knew there was something wrong with Father. I just knew. I just here it is. There's the smoking gun. That's the whole thing right there. He loves the Jesuits. So I don't know exactly why, other than the fact that I went to a Jesuit high school, went to a Jesuit college. I actually was in a Jesuit parish in the 1 year that I was in grad school, and I was had a Jesuit spiritual director. I don't know. I just, you know, that's probably not the whole reason. It's something I love. Jesuits, so the Jesuits is a religious order founded by St. Ignatius, properly, really, the Company of Jesus, or the Society of Jesus, you know, commonly called the Jesuits. Okay, when Jesuits are good, they are worth their weight in gold. They are, I think, they're one of the most powerful out there, you know. And St. Ignatius is just, he's awesome, to say the least. He's one of the, I think, underrated spiritual masters of the church's history. When Jesuits are bad, they are next to like Satan's sons. You know, they're really bad. When Jesuits are good, they're worth their weight in gold. When Jesuits are bad, they're not worth the powder to blow them up. I mean, they're just. And history in the last 500 years, there's a lot of history that you think. I mean, we would not be at this place were it not for the Jesuits. Simply speaking, they were the spiritual shock troops of the church for the period of the Counter-Reformation. Powerful. Nowadays, it's a real questionable bag. And you're gonna have to really discern well who you listen to. So when you have someone, I'll just throw out a couple names. One name that might be most familiar to people if you've ever watched EWTN is Father Mitch Pacwa. Father Mitch Pacwa is a faithful son of St. Ignatius, good man, good priest. Father Fessio, Joseph Fessio, which you don't really hear a lot, but he was the founder behind of Ignatius Press, great publishing company, etc., etc. But someone that you should be familiar with, and you can, he's got stuff out there, but it's not exactly always like everywhere where you would look, is a priest. He died, I think, in the year 2000. His cause for canonization actually is moving forward. I don't know where it's at, but Father John Hardin. Father John Hardin is he's a spiritual giant in many ways. He would be one of those Jesuits I'd be like, okay, he's worth his weight in gold. When I asked, St. Ignatius of Loyola never really wrote a whole lot. Okay, his masterpiece was the spiritual exercises. But the spiritual exercises, don't go out and run out and go get the spiritual exercise and be like, this is going to be awesome. Father said it was awesome, so I was going to read it, you know. And you'd be like, that's kind of hard to read, because it's not written as a book. It's written as a manual. It's written like a field manual. Like, if you do this, do that, and it contains absolute priceless gems. But you kind of need to get an idea of how it's supposed to be used. It's kind of an instruction manual, if you will, you know. So, and I remember once I asked, I was at a conference, Father Mitch Pacwa was speaking at, and I asked him afterwards, I said, who would you recommend, you know, to really help someone understand the spiritual exercises without even thinking, well, let me think here. It was Father John Hardin. Now, do not Google like spiritual exercises and just think whatever you're going to get out there, because you'll get some crazy, just some crap. You just get some horrible stuff out there.
So he will walk you through St. Ignatius's?
Well, and I'm kind of trying to get some sort of, so he's got a couple different, couple books that he wrote. There's what you want to kind of do, and I don't know that much about who's collected. He was a rather prolific speaker. I don't know how much he authored a number of books, but if you want, so it's the Father Hardin Archives. And so you can get a lot of good, and he's
there's something that you can get off of the EWTN where you can watch and he breaks down someone, I don't know his name.
now he's another. Now he is not a Jesuit. He is Father Timothy Gallagher. He is.
Yes. And you can buy
I don't know
those
what.
DVDs,
Yeah,
you can't watch
I'm
them.
not sure what his order is. His order, part of his the charism of that order is to give the spiritual exercise. He's very good. Now he is. Put it this way, I would highly recommend him as well. He is, and I'm not trying to. He's just a different personality than. I mean, he's a very gentle personality, and sometimes I'm like, just come on, just pop me in the head with this because I need,
He has a very calm voice,
yes.
the way he delivers
yes,
it.
he's and
Oh,
yeah,
no, she's
and
kidding.
he's very good. He's very. But he only, I don't know how much he definitely has stuff out there on the rules of discernment, and he's got about 5 different books, and I would highly recommend them. He's very, very good. Father Hardin, there's just, I don't know, maybe I have probably a bit of a bias just because he's a Jesuit. Like, if you're a good Jesuit, then you're just good, you know.
But his delivery is just maybe a little bit more.
Father Hardin is a hard one to listen to at times because a lot of the stuff that's recorded is when he was older than Moses. And he's got a very thin little whispery voice to begin with, and then you add 1,000 years on you. But he was an old guy when he died, you know. And so he's coming like, wait, what? You gotta have to listen. So Father Hardin also wrote he has a book, Retreat with the Lord, which is sort of the spiritual exercises. He's got another one called All My Liberty. And you don't have to, we all need to do spiritual reading. Father Hardin is just a really, I think he's a good one for this time because there is supposedly a book being written on his life. I don't know what stage it's at, but it was called, so the natives in this country, when the Jesuits would come to evangelize, they would call them the Black Robes because they wore, basically the Jesuit cassock is pretty much the Roman cassock without the buttons, and so basically it looks very similar. But so it was called, the biography that somebody is working on is called Black Robe, White Martyr. Father Hardin went through a lot, an awful lot, you know, and so he was reviled. If you know anything about the Jesuits and more of the modern Jesuit order, you'd be like, oh, okay, I can see that. So, but let me just read. And then I'll finish this because I don't want to. Well, already an hour in almost. So, okay, let me just read. You know what? Maybe. Oh yes. So. Okay, so Father Hardin says, with due proportion, okay, the spirits, meaning the good spirit, God, the evil spirit, Satan, the spirits act in comparatively the same way. Now, this is sort of a comment on the second rule. Okay. Oh, no, I'm sorry. You know what? I just stuck on the second rule. Okay. Erase that. I'll just read him. Figure it out yourself. So with due proportion, the spirits act in comparatively the same way towards tepid souls as they would towards those who are steeped in sin. This is really the first rule. So if you're not, well, I'm not going from mortal sin to mortal sin, sort of, I guess. I don't know. I just don't really care that much. You know, when it's just sort of like, you know, you're just sort of
Or just
both the good. So basically, if you are really zealous to do God's will, the enemy is going to try to basically very simply put, he's going to bring a lot of anxiety into your life so that you're discouraged and you don't do God's will. Whereas God's going to give you a lot of peace and strength so you do his will, if you are seeking to do his will. If you are, on the other hand, just saying, you're going from mortal sin to mortal sin, and you're just sort of tepid, you're just like, look, we're not going to get excited about anything. We're just going to, maybe I'll just stamp my ticket every once in a while, I'll get to mass every once in a while, and this and that. Basically, the enemy is going to work with you the same way because you're doing his will. You're moving in that wrong direction, okay? And God's going to work at trying to smack you upside the head and wake you up. So Father Hardin says, the devil tries to inspire false security and deceptive peace of mind, while God and his angels seek to arouse the sluggard from tepidity. When a prospective course of action, and this is key, when a prospective course of action comes to mind or has been undertaken, and it gives rise to anxiety and disquiet, I must inquire in what direction the anxiety is leading. Does it tend to inhibit or to assist what I know in conscience is the better part of me? So I'm like, I know that it would be better to do this, but man, I'm just so frustrated and so discouraged. And it's preventing you from doing what you know is the better thing. I know I need to get to confession, but I am just overwhelmed with anxiety. What's the priest going to say to me? What's going to happen? That's not God. That's the enemy. Okay. So if it hinders, the devil should be suspected. If it assists, the presence of God may be assumed. The same holds true when a sense of peace and tranquility occurs. So just because you're like, oh, I feel very peaceful about this. Okay, we're good. This is good. If whatever it may be. I tried to go to confession twice, and the priest wasn't there. He wasn't available. Whatever. It's like, what? God must be saying it's okay. So we're good. It's good. I'm at peace with this. If this favors and makes easier the practice of things which reason and faith have always told me are God's will, the good spirit is most probably active. If it hinders this side of my immoral life, the devil is most likely the agent. So it's not enough for us. And I know if this is the first time you've ever heard any of this stuff, I know it might be like, wait, okay, what So basically, what St. Ignatius is saying, and what Father Hardin is kind of just making comments on, is if I am seeking to do my will, whatever that may be, it might be very respectable, whatever it is, and if I'm not really seeking to do God's will, the enemy is just going to make everything just, all right, we're peaceful, because you're doing what I want you to do, so I'm just going to keep everything, why would I want to rock the boat on this? Whereas God's going to want to try to rock the boat because you're not doing what he wants. We are not going in the right direction. Okay. Versus if we're seeking to do God's will, if that's really what I want to do. Okay. And I have a certain zeal, I can't be just like, yeah, I don't know. I guess it'd be nice to do God's will. I'm not going to get all excited about it. That you're probably on the tepid side. So the enemy's like, yeah, don't get all excited about that. Just keep doing whatever you're doing, because you're probably doing the wrong thing anyway. If you're just like, maybe I'll do God's will. I guess that'd be nice if it was easy. But it's not really easy. So I'm not, and you're tepid. You're going down the tube. So, but if you are like, I really want to do God's will. That's really what I want to do. If I had one choice in life, it'd be like, do God's will. Absolutely. And I'm trying to make progress in that. I'm not just like, well, it'd be nice to do God's will. That sounds good. Yeah, sure. I'll agree. I'll sign up for it eventually. You're in the trenches. You're actually making some steps forward, Then the enemy's like, no, this is not going in the right direction. So I'm going to clamp down on this guy, and I'm going to give him anxiety and frustration and discouragement and everything, because I want to paralyze him, stop him in his tracks. Whereas God's like, no, this is exactly the trajectory I want this guy to be going in. So I'm going to encourage him. I'm going to give him strength. I'm going to give him, So that's how we can't just say, well, I'm at peace with it. That's good, Because I've had people who are like, no, I'm good with this. Yeah, but that's subjectively, evil. Hmm. That's your opinion. So does that, like I said, I don't want to, and I will end before the break on just something I want to hand out with that. So I know that was like a whole bunch that I just threw at you, and especially if this is like the first time you've heard that, it's a lot to sort of, but it's good to kind of take that and say, okay, let me just try to figure that out, and apply it, most importantly, to our lives. So let me just, this is just something which I thought was very interesting. This is just from that website, Father Hardin's Archives. And like I said, I don't know if I don't think I might not have, I only made 10 copies, so I'm not sure. But as soon as I read this, I'll just, whoever wants this. So it's the last little section of a talk that he gave on, as it says, the gift of discernment. So how to discriminate. Okay. All that I have just said is the answer to how, but let me add 3 suggestions at the end. First, watch the conduct of people. Ideas, because you cannot, and I hate to say, you can't trust everybody in the church. I hate to say it that way, but it's just, that's what it is. It's always been that way. I mean, for heaven's sakes, within the 12 was Judas, so you couldn't, but unfortunately in today's culture, well, not to say culture, but in today's situation, just because someone's got a collar on does not mean, oh, well, I'm sure I can trust him. Maybe, maybe not. So first, watch the conduct of people. Ideas are often hard to identify. People can be recognized. Are they humble and patient? Are they respectful of the Holy See? Which I know it's an interesting reality, but we're not going to get into that tonight. Are they docile to the teachings of the church, not to the opinions of one person, one bishop, one this, but are they docile? Okay, I need, even if they don't agree with them, they're like, you know what, I don't really understand this, I don't really agree with this, but I'm going to live it out because I just know that that's good. If they're not, no matter what else you may like about them, protect yourselves. They are dangerous. They might be a really nice person. I've met somebody who, I won't say who, but it was a high person in the church in the United States. Okay, they were extremely influential, and their influence actually goes beyond death because their proteges have been influencing things. Nice guy, real friendly, very nice to the seminarians and everything like that. Okay, got as Father Hardin is pointing out. So second, by expecting false teachers to disguise their intentions, okay, this is going to happen. They are attractive. They are disarmingly nice people. They are generally pious people. Okay, he experienced this a lot, so he lived this out for decades. Expect error to be in disguise. Like I said, Satan's not going to just say, "Oh, hey, I'm Satan, and I want to bring you to hell. So you want to come?" It's going to be, disguise. It's going to be the hook's going to have to get some bait on it. And finally, by recognizing with St. John that the surest mark of Christ's Spirit in what we hear, in what we read, in what we see or observe is the humble submission to Christ's teaching. Conversely, the plainest mark of the Antichrist is the proud unwillingness to follow this teaching as interpreted by the church. And like I said, interpreted by the church, not by someone's opinion who might even be in a high place. But what's the constant teaching of the church? Okay, got it. That's how it's interpreted by the church. The first is to be followed because it's true, and the truth is identified by humility. The second is to be avoided because it's false, and falsehood is always identified by its pride. Don't let other people convince you of someone else's humility. Don't let the media say, "Oh, look how humble this person is." Are they humble? Is it true humility? Because there's a lot of false humility out there. Anyway, but humility is always the sign of someone growing in holiness, because you can't have true humility without someone seeking with a zeal, with a fervor to live God's will. So I know that's a lot, and that's pretty thick stuff. And so if your mind's a little bit like getting some of this, not getting all of it, don't feel bad. You're not stupid or anything like that. It's just this is kind of thick stuff, you know. But I don't know. I just thought it'd be good to kind of put out there because sometimes, once again, and then we'll take a break. We think of the enemy as just like, man, don't want to get possessed. Yeah, we don't want to get possessed. You're right, but there's a lot worse things out there. And we'll be like, well, what could be worse than being possessed? You know, being in mortal sin and having no repentance. You know, like I said, you can be possessed by 1,001 demons and die. Die in the grace of baptism. We're in. They didn't get us. But we could be just hanging on to one unrepentant mortal sin. You know, at our death, you'd be like, I'm not giving this up. And we could be totally respectful, be like, that guy was the nicest neighbor ever. Helped us all the time. You know, whatever, blah, 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 blah. But we held on to that one unrepentant mortal sin. We've decided for ourselves. We don't want anything to do with God for all eternity. We're heading down. So, all right, let's go ahead and have a break. Long deserved.